In the early 1960s, Sydney was a vibrant city, unaware that a predator was moving quietly through its streets. Between 1961 and 1962, 5 men would fall victim to a killer whose brutality shocked Australia and left investigators scrambling for answers. His name was William Macdonald, an English migrant who blended into the city by day and hunted its most vulnerable by night. Known later as the Mutilator, Macdonald became one of Australia's earliest recognised serial killers, targeting men he lured with alcohol before attacking them with sudden, frenzied violence. His crimes unfolded across familiar Sydney locations, Darlinghurst, Moore Park, and the Domain, turning ordinary public spaces into scenes of horror. In today's episode, we explore the life and crimes of William Macdonald, a killer whose brutality left a lasting mark on Australia. If you enjoy these episodes, I encourage you to follow or subscribe to Criminal Interrupted on your favourite podcast app. As I've mentioned before, I'm currently focusing on this podcast full-time due to a heart condition, so every follow and review makes a huge difference. Thank you for listening and for your incredible support. This is Criminal Interrupted. Gladestone William Macdonald, born on the 17th of June 1924, would one day become synonymous with one of Australia's earliest and most disturbing serial murder cases. But before the newspaper called him the Mutilator, before the courts labelled him a monster, and long before Sydney learned to fear the quiet man who drifted through its parks and train stations, he was simply a boy from Liverpool. A boy born into a city still scarred by the First World War, raised in a family doing its best to survive the grinding poverty of the interwar years. William was a middle child of 3 sons. His parents worked hard, but like many working-class families in Liverpool at the time, they lived with constant financial strain. The city was crowded, industrial, and unforgiving. Yet even in a place where hardship was common, William stood out. Not because he was troublesome or rebellious, but because he seemed to exist slightly apart from the world around him. From an early age, he was noticeably withdrawn. He didn't play with other children, didn't seek out friendships, and rarely showed interest in the games, noise, and chaos that filled the streets of Liverpool. His brothers later recalled that he never seemed to need the kind of connection most children crave. He was closest to his mother, but even that bond felt muted, as though he was always holding part of himself back. As he grew older, his behaviour became increasingly unusual. His mother would often wake in the middle of the night to find him gone. William had slipped out of the house again, wandering the streets alone. Whether he was a young boy or already in his early teens, the pattern never changed. He drifted through the city in silence, unreachable, as if the night offered him something the daylight never could. His mother frequently had to call the police to help locate him. To neighbours and relatives, he was simply odd, a child who didn't quite fit into the world he'd been born into. By his teenage years, the signs of deeper psychological stress were impossible to ignore. William was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia, a condition that, in the 1930s and 40s, carried enormous stigma and had almost no effective treatment. Mental illness was poorly understood, and families were often left to cope alone. His parents tried to manage as best as they could, but the medical system offered little support, and the social environment was unforgiving. In 1943, at the age of 19, William was conscripted into the British Army. For some people with mental illness, the rigid structure of military life could provide stability. But for William, the army became the setting for the most traumatic event of his life. While stationed in Lancashire, he was raped by a corporal in an air raid shelter, a violent assault followed by threats of death if he ever spoke about it. This was likely his first sexual experience, and it fused sexuality, violence, and fear in a way that would shape him for decades. The trauma didn't end when the assault did. William carried the experience silently, unable to tell anyone, unable to seek help. In the rigid, hyper-masculine environment of the military, and in a society where homosexuality was criminalised, he had no safe place to turn. The shame, fear, and confusion festered inside him, deepening his paranoia and worsening his mental health. When he was discharged from the army in 1947, he returned home a profoundly changed young man. He was now openly homosexual at a time when homosexuality was not only condemned, but illegal under British law. In 1940s Liverpool, public solicitation could lead to arrest, imprisonment, and lifelong social ruin. William began frequenting public toilets and pubs, seeking encounters that were both dangerous and criminalised. The ridicule and harassment he faced only intensified his sense of persecution. He told a psychiatrist that he felt watched, that people were talking about him, that he heard strange noises and voices. These were the clear signs of a psychotic episode. His family, overwhelmed and frightened, eventually made the difficult decision to have him committed. His older brother arranged for him to be sectioned and sent to a psychiatric institution in Scotland. The asylum he entered was overcrowded, underfunded, and brutally cold. Mental health treatment in the 1940s was harsh, experimental, and often traumatic. William underwent electroconvulsive therapy, which is electric shocks delivered to the brain in the hope of resetting it. He endured hydrotherapy, where patients were strapped into scalding hot baths for long periods before being plunged into freezing cold water, and he was subjected to insulin coma therapy, a procedure that induced deep comas under the misguided belief that the brain might somehow restart itself upon waking. None of these treatments cured schizophrenia. Today we recognize them as crude and often harmful interventions, but at the time they were considered cutting edge. For William, they were simply more trauma layered on top of trauma. After several months, his mother removed him from the institution and brought him home. But the William who returned was not the same boy she had raised. He was withdrawn, unpredictable, and deeply scarred, psychologically, emotionally, and physically. He had endured rape, military trauma, institutionalization, and invasive psychiatric procedures. His behavior became increasingly abnormal, noticeable, and difficult for his family to manage. By the early 1950s, it was clear that staying in Liverpool was no longer an option. William's mental state was deteriorating, his behaviour growing harder for those around him to understand, and the city itself offered little compassion or safety. Homosexuality remained criminalised, mental illnesses carried deep social shame, and William seemed to sense that the only way forward was to leave, to find a place where he could fade into the background. So he left. He first went to Canada, travelling alone and slipping from one temporary job to the next, staying in whatever cheap rooms he could find. But the distance didn't bring the peace he'd imagined. The same shadows followed him, the loneliness, the confusion, the constant feeling that people were watching or mocking him. The voices in his mind made the journey too, whispering and needling at his thoughts, deepening his paranoia. Canada was only a brief stop. Before long, he moved again, this time to Australia in the late 1950s. For British migrants, Australia was sold as a place to start fresh, a country where reinvention was not only possible but encouraged. And for someone like William, it offered exactly what he seemed to need, a vast, unfamiliar landscape where a man could disappear into the flow of transient workers and leave almost no trace behind. He first settled in South Australia, but almost immediately the same behaviours that had caused trouble in Liverpool resurfaced. He began frequenting public toilets, seeking out men, and attempting to initiate contact. Homosexuality was still illegal in Australia, and police regularly patrolled known meeting spots. One night, William approached a man in a public toilet, not realising the man was an undercover police officer. He touched the officer's genitals, was arrested on the spot, and charged with indecent assault. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison, though he served closer to a year. For someone with untreated schizophrenia, incarceration was another destabilising blow. The isolation, the lack of support, and the constant threat of violence, all of it deepened his paranoia and reinforced his belief that the world was against him. When he was released, he didn't stay in South Australia. He moved again, this time to Ballarat in Victoria. He worked on building sites, took labouring jobs, and tried to blend in. But William was not someone who blended easily. His odd mannerisms, his quietness, his inability to socialise normally, all of it made him stand out. Co-workers mocked him and whispered about him, and the bullying followed him wherever he went. Each new job, each new town, brought the same treatment. In response, he changed his name again and again, adopting fresh identities wherever he felt people turning against him. But the reinvention never worked. The same cycle always returned: ridicule, paranoia, withdrawal, and eventually escape. He eventually drifted north to Brisbane, and it was there, in the city's heavy, humid heat, that the violence first emerged. William was drinking heavily by then. Alcohol softened the voices in his head and eased the sharp edges of his paranoia, giving him brief moments of quiet. Most nights he could be found in the bars, nursing sherry and blending into the city's homeless community. He lived in a boarding house, keeping to himself and attracting little attention. The first killing took place in Brisbane in 1961. William met a 63-year-old man named Amos Hugh Hurst outside the Roma Street railway station. The two spent hours drinking together in a nearby pub before returning to Hurst's apartment, where the drinking continued. As the night wore on and Hurst became heavily intoxicated, Macdonald's paranoia took hold. Without warning, he began to strangle him. Hurst was so drunk he barely understood what was happening, and as he collapsed, Macdonald struck him, delivering the final blow. When it was over, Macdonald arranged the scene with a strange, deliberate calm. He placed Hurst on the bed, removed his shoes and trousers, and pulled the sheets up over him as though tucking him in for sleep. He waited in the dark for a while, then quietly left the apartment. The death raised no suspicion. A heavily intoxicated man found dead in his own room was not unusual, and the coroner ruled it as natural causes. No one questioned it. No one connected it to the quiet British migrant who had already slipped out of Brisbane. In William's mind, he had no choice but to run. He was convinced the police were coming, that people knew what he had done, that the voices were urging him to leave. So he moved again, this time to Sydney. Sydney in the early 1960s was energetic and full of opportunity, but it also offered something William relied on: anonymity. He rented a small shop with a flat above it, worked during the day, and drank at night. For a time, he managed to keep himself steady, but the voices crept back. The paranoia tightened its grip, and the loneliness, the deep, unrelenting loneliness of a man who had never truly belonged anywhere, began to overwhelm him. He spent his nights in bars, parks, and public spaces where homeless men gathered. He drank with them, talked with them, watched them. There is no indication he pursued sexual relationships during this period. His fixation appeared to stem more from confusion and past trauma than from genuine desire. His crimes were not sexually motivated. They were driven by delusion, fear, and a compulsion he could not control. The next killing took place in Sydney in June 1961. William Macdonald met 41-year-old Alfred Reginald Greenfeld while he was sitting on a park bench in Green Park, just across from St. Vincent's Hospital in Darlinghurst. Greenfield was friendly, had been drinking, and didn't question Macdonald's offer of more alcohol. The two walked together towards the nearby Domain Baths, where they continued drinking until Greenfeld eventually drifted into sleep. When the moment felt right, Macdonald reached into the carrier bag he always carried. Inside was a waterproof trench coat and a long knife. He put on the coat, drew the knife, and attacked. Greenfield was stabbed repeatedly, more than 30 times. The first blow alone severing major arteries. In the frenzy that followed, Macdonald mutilated the body, placed the severed genitals in a plastic bag, and later threw them into the Sydney harbour. Sydney had never seen anything like it. The murder was immediately recognised as a brutal homicide. Greenfield's nude body was discovered at the Domain Baths, and the violence was so extreme that newspapers quickly warned the public of a sadistic killer targeting vulnerable men. Yet no one connected the crime to the earlier death in Brisbane. The quiet shopkeeper living in Sydney was not on anyone's radar. Police had no witnesses, no forensic tools, and a victim who, like many of Macdonald's targets, lived a transient life with few connections. Fear spread rapidly through the city, but investigators had nothing to guide them. A few weeks after the Greenfield murder, Macdonald killed again. This time the victim was 37-year-old Ernest William Cobbin, a man he encountered while walking along South Dowling Street. Cobbin had been drinking and was open to company, and Macdonald easily persuaded him to head towards Moore Park, where the two continued drinking inside a public toilet block. When Cobbin became relaxed and unguarded, Macdonald prepared himself in the same ritualistic way he had before. He put on the plastic raincoat he carried in his bag, took out his knife, and waited for the moment to strike. Cobbin was sitting on the toilet seat when Macdonald suddenly attacked, stabbing him repeatedly with extreme force. The violence was swift and overwhelming, leaving Cobbin no chance to defend himself. After the killing, Macdonald mutilated the body, placed the severed genitals and his knife into a plastic bag, and left the scene. On the walk home, he washed the blood from his hands and face. Cobbin's body was discovered soon after, and Sydney spiraled into panic. The killings were savage, unpredictable, and seemingly without motive. Police increased patrols, but they had no leads. Meanwhile, Macdonald remained invisible, a quiet shopkeeper blending into the city's background. Weeks passed before he struck again. The pattern was unchanged. A vulnerable man, alcohol, and a night that ended in violence. There was a moment when it seemed the violence might stop. One night, Macdonald approached a man in a park who was so intoxicated he collapsed onto the ground. Macdonald put on his trench coat, took out his knife, and prepared to kill him, but something made him hesitate. He later claimed the voices in his head told him to walk away. The man survived, never knowing how close he had come to becoming another victim. But the pause was brief. On the 31st of March 1962, Macdonald crossed paths with 55-year-old Frank Gladstone McLean in Darlinghurst. Earlier that day, he had purchased a new knife from a sports store. That night, after leaving the Oxford Hotel, he followed McLean down Burke Street, even passing the local police station. He struck up a conversation and suggested they share a drink in the nearby Burke Lane. Once they were alone, Macdonald plunged the knife into McLean's throat. McLean tried to fight back, but he was too intoxicated to defend himself. Macdonald stabbed him again, punched him, and forced him off balance. The attack was interrupted when a young family walked past. Hearing their voices and the cry of a baby, Macdonald hid in the shadows. When they were gone, he returned to the barely conscious McLean, dragged him deeper into the lane, and stabbed him again. McLean suffered 6 stab wounds in total. Macdonald then mutilated the body, placed the severed remains into a plastic bag, and took them home before disposing them the next day. McLean was found still alive by a passerby walking with his wife and child, but he died shortly after. The precision of the injuries unsettled investigators. Some officers became convinced they were dealing with a disturbed surgeon, someone with medical training, someone capable of making deliberate, confident cuts. Doctors across Sydney were questioned, and their movements were scrutinised. Despite the intensity of the search, investigators never looked in Macdonald's direction, leaving him free to kill again. On the night of the 6th of June 1962, Macdonald met 37-year-old Patrick Joseph Hackett in a wine saloon in Pitt Street. Hackett had recently been released from prison and was drinking heavily. The two went back to Macdonald's new residence, where they continued drinking until Hackett fell asleep on the floor. Macdonald retrieved a boning knife he used in his delicatessen and stabbed Hackett in the neck. The blow passed straight through. Hackett woke and tried to defend himself, pushing the knife back into Macdonald's other hand and cutting it badly. Macdonald launched into a renewed attack, eventually stabbing Hackett through the heart. He continued until he was out of breath. Exhausted and drunk, he fell asleep beside the body. By morning, the scene was catastrophic. Blood had soaked through the floorboards and was close to dripping onto the shop counter below. Macdonald cleaned himself up and went to a hospital to have his hand stitched, claiming he had cut himself while working. When he returned, he dragged Hackett's body into the crawl space beneath the shop, a cramped, dusty void barely 2 feet high. and fled to Brisbane, convinced the police would soon come looking for him. 3 weeks later, neighbours noticed a foul smell coming from the building. The health department was called and then the police. On the 20th of November 1962, officers crawled beneath the shop and found the decomposing body. It was far too gone to identify, but an autopsy suggested the victim was in his 40s, matching the age of the missing shopkeeper, William Macdonald, who was going by Alan Edward Brennan. Investigators assumed the body was his. No one connected it to the earlier killings. In fact, police profiled the murderer as someone operating exclusively in Sydney's inner eastern suburbs, many kilometres from Concord. Meanwhile, Macdonald had already vanished. He returned to Brisbane, slipping back into anonymity with ease. He found work, kept to himself, and lived quietly, certain he had escaped again. He believed the voices had guided him correctly, that Sydney police would never connect the deaths, and that he remained beyond suspicion. Back in Sydney, fear was tightening its grip. 4 men were dead, 3 had been mutilated, 1 had been hidden beneath a shop. Yet investigators still had no suspect, no motive, and no understanding of the pattern forming around them. The victims lived on the margins, homeless, transient, and often intoxicated. Men who moved through the city unnoticed, with no fixed addresses and no one to speak for them. Their vulnerability made them easy targets, and their invisibility made them easy to overlook. For 6 weeks, Macdonald lived quietly in Brisbane, convinced he'd slipped away once more. Each morning he bought the newspapers, scanning for any mention of the body he'd left behind. He expected headlines, appeals for information, some sign the investigation was gaining momentum. Instead, he found silence. No reports, no updates, nothing to suggest the police had connected the discovery to the earlier murders. To him, the lack of news meant safety. The body had certainly been found. The smell alone would have forced someone to act. But the absence of publicity convinced him the authorities were still in the dark. That confidence led him to make the decision that would ultimately expose him. He returned to Sydney. He walked the streets as though nothing had happened, blending into the crowds as easily as before. But Sydney had not forgotten him. One afternoon, a man who had known him stopped in shock, staring as if he were looking at an apparition. He told William that a memorial service had been held for him, that he had been declared dead. Macdonald froze, then turned and ran. The witness, shaken and confused, went straight to the police. The witness insisted he had just seen William Macdonald alive, the very man police believed was lying dead beneath the shop in Concord. Officers dismissed him immediately, accusing him of being drunk and telling him to go home and sleep it off. Some even suggested he was imagining things. But he refused to let it go. He returned the next day determined, and tried again to explain what he had just seen. The police still didn't believe him. Realising he was getting nowhere, he went straight to the Daily Mirror and spoke to the crime reporter Joe Morris. He explained how he just bumped into the man who was supposed to be dead, the shopkeeper known as Brennan, who was in reality William Macdonald. Morris found the account credible and published the story under the headline, Case of the Walking Corpse. The headline changed everything. Publication forced police to exhume the body found beneath the shop. Fingerprint analysis confirmed what the witness had been trying to tell them all along. The corpse was not Macdonald. It was Patrick Hackett. A closer examination revealed multiple stab wounds and mutilation, linking the death to the same pattern seen in the earlier murders attributed to the man the press had already begun calling the Mutilator. It was the first real break in the case, the moment the narrative shifted. Without that witness refusing to be silenced, the murders might have continued, and the real killer might have vanished again. Once investigators began searching for the man they had mistakenly declared dead, the truth surfaced quickly. Police produced a sketch of Macdonald and circulated it nationwide. By that time, he'd already taken a job on the Melbourne Railways under the alias David Allen. He dyed his hair, grew a mustache, and tried to blend in, but his co-workers recognised him almost immediately. Melbourne police arrested him as he collected his weekly pay. When they finally brought him in, the arrest was nothing like the public imagined. The man who had terrified Sydney turned out to be quiet, slight, and almost timid, bearing no resemblance to the monstrous figure described in the headlines. Under questioning, he confessed. He admitted to the Sydney murders, to the mutilations, and even to the first killing in Brisbane, the one originally ruled as natural causes. For investigators, the scale of his crimes was staggering. For Sydney, it was a moment of collective relief. After months of fear, the city finally had a name. During further interviews, Macdonald explained his actions as the result of an overwhelming urge he could not control. He spoke of being raped as a teenager and claimed he chose his victims at random to disempower the man he believed had assaulted him. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he said the voices in his head told him that each victim was the corporal who had raped him years earlier. With the confession secured, the case moved swiftly towards court. He was charged with 5 counts of murder and committed for trial on August 15, 1963. The trial began the following month and quickly became one of the most sensational in Australian history. Macdonald pleaded not guilty on the grounds of insanity and testified in disturbing detail about the killings. His descriptions were so confronting that several jurors fainted and had to be removed from the courtroom. Despite extensive psychiatric evidence supporting insanity, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, a decision that astonished mental health experts. Before sentencing, Justice McLennan described the case as the most barbaric series of murders he'd encountered in his career. Macdonald showed no remorse and made it clear that, if released, he would kill again. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences, with a strong recommendation that he never be released. After his conviction, William Macdonald was sent to Long Bay Hospital, a division of the Long Bay Correctional Centre. It didn't take long for authority to certify him as insane, and he was transferred to a secure psychiatric facility within the prison system. From that point on, he lived under constant supervision, effectively disappearing from public view. Inside prison, Macdonald became known simply as Bill. Over the years, he slipped into a routine so rigid and predictable that staff described him as deeply institutionalised. He had been behind bars longer than anyone else in New South Wales, and the outside world had become a place he no longer understood. In a rare comment made in 2003, he said plainly, quote, "I have no desire to go and live on the outside. I wouldn't last 5 minutes," end quote. His life in custody was uneventful, marked by the quiet repetition of someone who had surrendered entirely to the structure around him. He was considered a compliant inmate, rarely causing trouble, and spending most of his time in the hospital wing due to his age and mental health needs. According to the coronial records, he remained under the care of the Justice Health and Forensic Mental Health Network, receiving ongoing psychiatric oversight until the end of his life. Macdonald's final years were spent in frail health. He required aged care level support within the prison hospital, and his world had shrunk to a small circle of medical staff and correctional officers. He had no visitors, no family contact, and no ties to the community he'd once terrorised. By then, he had spent more than half a century in custody, longer than any inmate in New South Wales history. On the 12th of May 2015, at the age of 90, William Macdonald died from a gastrointestinal blockage at Prince of Wales Hospital in Randwick. He died still in custody, still under his life sentences, and still known to the public only by the name that had defined him for decades, the Mutilator. In the end, the story of William Macdonald is not simply the story of a serial killer. It is a stark illustration of what can happen when trauma, untreated mental illness, and social neglect collide. His actions devastated the lives of men who had done nothing to him, men who never knew him, and men who never deserved the violence that found them. His victims were vulnerable individuals living on the edges of society, men who accepted a drink or a moment of company from a stranger. Their names rarely appeared in the headlines, overshadowed by the brutality of the crimes, but they mattered. They were human beings with pasts, with hopes, and with people who cared about them, people who were left without answers. Macdonald spent more than 50 years in custody, the longest-serving prisoner in Australian history. His confinement kept others safe, but it did not undo the harm he caused. Whatever shaped him, trauma, delusion, or the voices he claimed to hear, does not diminish his responsibility. Mental illness can explain behaviour, but it cannot excuse murder. Nothing justifies the suffering he inflicted. William Macdonald died at the age of 90. His victims never had the chance to reach old age. Their lives ended abruptly, in fear and in isolation. That is the legacy of this case, a reminder of the cost of neglect, the weight of unaddressed trauma, and the importance of seeing and safeguarding those whom society too often overlooks. Thank you for listening.